They called you too sensitive, too emotional, too much. And you believed them. You shrunk. You apologized. You carried people who never once asked, "Are you okay?" But here's what they never saw coming. That quiet, that stillness, that sudden disappearance, that wasn't weakness. That was the most dangerous decision a human being can make. See, empaths don't get loud when they're done. They get unreachable, no argument, no warning, no dramatic exit. Just peace. And the moment an empath finds real peace, you stop existing to them. Completely, quietly, permanently. You expected tears. You expected begging. Instead, you got silence. And that silence from someone who once gave you everything is the most devastating thing you will ever experience. Because you can't fight it. You can't fix it. You can't reverse it. They're not angry anymore. They're just done. And done from an empath hits different than anything you've ever felt. That is the silent revenge of an empath. Let me tell you something that took most empaths years to figure out. And the moment they figured it out, everything changed. You were never the problem. Not once. Not ever. But somewhere along the way, somebody made you believe that feeling deeply was a flaw, that caring too much was a character defect, that your sensitivity was something to be ashamed of, hidden, managed, controlled. And the cruelest part? You listened. You started apologizing for your emotions before anyone even asked. You made yourself smaller in rooms where you deserved to take up space. You swallowed your truth to protect someone else's comfort, someone who never once lost a single night of sleep over yours. That's not weakness. That's conditioning. There's a fundamental difference, and most people never stop long enough to see it. Weakness is not knowing what you're capable of. What happened to you? That was manipulation dressed up as love. That was control disguised as concern. Someone looked at the depth of what you could feel, and instead of honoring it, they weaponized it. They used your empathy as a leash. They pulled it every time you got too close to realizing your own power. Because here's what they understood about you, even when you didn't understand it about yourself. You feel things at a frequency most people will never access in their entire lives. You walk into a room and you already know who's hurting. You can sense a shift in someone's energy before they've said a single word. You absorb emotions the way a sponge absorbs water, completely, instantly, without resistance. That is not a weakness. That is an intelligence. A rare, sophisticated, deeply human intelligence that the world spent centuries misunderstanding and threatened people spent lifetimes trying to suppress. Think about what it actually takes to feel what another person feels, to carry someone else's pain alongside your own and still show up, still give, still try. The average person cannot do that. They don't have the emotional range. They don't have the depth. So when they encountered someone who did, someone like you, the easiest thing to do was call it a problem. Because your sensitivity exposed them. Your awareness made them uncomfortable. Your ability to read between the lines meant you could see things they desperately needed to stay hidden. And a person with something to hide will always, always try to convince you that your vision is the problem, not what they're hiding. So they called you too sensitive, too intense, too emotional. And you carried that label for years. You tried to feel less. You tried to care less. You tried to switch off something that was never meant to be switched off, because it wasn't broken. It was brilliant. And somewhere deep inside, you always knew that. That quiet voice that kept saying, "This doesn't feel right," that was never weakness talking. That was awareness. That was discernment. That was the most powerful internal compass a human being can possess. The strongest people on this planet are not the ones who never feel. The strongest people are the ones who feel everything, every tremor, every shift, every unspoken tension in a room, and still choose how they respond. That kind of emotional control doesn't come from being numb. It comes from being deeply, profoundly aware. And awareness, or real awareness, is power. You were never too sensitive for this world. This world was just not ready for someone who could see it so clearly. Most people think power sounds like something. A raised voice, a sharp comeback, a perfectly timed argument that leaves the other person speechless. We've been conditioned to believe that whoever speaks loudest wins, that whoever fights hardest wins. That presence means noise and strength means volume. But the most dangerous people in any room aren't the loudest ones. They're the quiet ones. And when an empath, someone who spent years over-explaining, over-communicating, over-giving, suddenly goes silent, that's not retreat. That is not surrender. That is not them falling apart behind closed doors. That is a decision. And decisions made in silence are the ones that change everything. Think about what silence actually communicates. When you stop arguing with someone, you're not telling them they're right. You're telling them they're no longer worth the energy it takes to correct. That is a devastating message, and it lands harder than any argument ever could. Because arguments give people something to grab onto, something to defend against, something to deflect and twist and manipulate. But silence? You cannot argue with silence. You cannot manipulate silence. You cannot gaslight someone who has stopped engaging with your reality entirely. Silence removes the weapon right out of their hands. See, most toxic dynamics survive on one thing: reaction. They need you to react. They provoke because provocation gets a response, and response means connection, and connection means control. Every time you argued back, every time you defended yourself, every time you explained your feelings to someone who had already decided not to understand them, you were feeding the very thing that was draining you. You were keeping the cycle alive. And then one day, something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly somewhere deep inside, and something clicked, and you stopped. Not because you gave up, not because you had nothing left to say. You stopped because you finally understood that some conversations are not meant to create understanding. They're meant to create confusion. And you were done being confused on purpose. That silence that followed, that wasn't emptiness. That was clarity wearing a quiet face. And the person on the receiving end of that silence felt it immediately. Because they were used to pulling your strings, and suddenly the strings weren't attached to anything anymore. They pushed nothing. They provoked nothing. They waited for the reaction they'd trained you to give, and it never came. That is when panic sets in for them, because a person who no longer reacts to you is a person you can no longer control. And losing control over someone you've manipulated for years is genuinely terrifying for a certain type of person. They'll escalate. They'll try harder. They'll come at you with more force because they're desperately trying to find the button that still works. But you already disconnected the buttons. And here's what makes the silence even more powerful: what it gives you something arguing never could. It gives you time. Time to think clearly. Time to see the situation for what it actually is instead of what you were told it was. When you stop reacting, you start observing. An observation, real, calm, unattached observation, reveals things that emotional chaos always kept hidden. You start seeing patterns. You start seeing the manipulation for what it is. You start understanding that the story you were told about yourself was never true. It was just repeated loudly enough and long enough that it started to feel like truth. Silence breaks that spell, because in the quiet, you finally hear yourself again. And the moment you hear yourself, really hear yourself, nobody else's version of you stands a chance. When most people hear the word revenge, they picture something dark, something angry, something calculated and cold. A plan designed to make someone suffer the way they made you suffer. We've seen it in movies. We've read it in stories. This idea that revenge is about going back, returning to the scene of your pain and burning it down. But that version of revenge, that's not power. That's still attachment. And attachment to someone who hurt you is just another form of prison, one you built yourself and handed them the key to. Real revenge, the kind that actually transforms your life, has nothing to do with them. It doesn't involve them. It doesn't require their awareness, their guilt, their apology, or their suffering. Real revenge is so quiet, so internal, so deeply personal that the person who hurt you might not even recognize it when they see it. Because it doesn't look like destruction. It looks like you, standing in your own light, becoming someone they never thought you could be. That is the most disorienting thing a person who underestimated you can ever witness. Think about what it takes to truly transform after deep emotional pain. Most people don't do it. Most people carry their wounds forward, into the next relationship, the next job, the next version of their life. And those wounds quietly shape every decision they make. They become smaller, more guarded, more convinced that the world is dangerous and people cannot be trusted. But empaths, when they finally wake up, they do something different. They alchemize. They take everything that was done to them, every dismissal, every manipulation, every moment they were made to feel like too much or not enough, and they turn it into fuel. Not the angry kind of fuel that burns everything around it, the focused kind. The quiet, relentless, undeniable kind that builds something real. And this transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens in the small moments nobody sees. It happens at midnight when you choose to sit with your pain instead of running from it. It happens when you start setting a boundary and your hands are shaking, but you do it anyway. It happens when you look in the mirror and for the first time in a long time, you don't see what they told you was there. You see something they completely failed to destroy. That moment, that quiet, private, deeply personal moment, that is where revenge actually begins. Not in their downfall, in your rising. Because here's what transformation does that destruction never could. It removes them from the center of your story. Destruction keeps them relevant. It keeps your energy pointed at them, your attention on them, your emotional bandwidth consumed by thoughts of them. You're still living inside the narrative they created, you're just playing a different role in it. But transformation rewrites the entire story. Suddenly you're not the person they hurt. You're not the person who survived them. You are something entirely new, something that exists completely independent of whatever they did or didn't do to you. Your identity is no longer shaped by that relationship. Your future is no longer shadowed by that pain. You outgrew the wound. And outgrowing something is so much more powerful than destroying it, because it means you took something that was meant to break you and you used it as raw material. Every cruel word became clarity. Every betrayal became a boundary. Every moment they made you doubt yourself became a reason to know yourself more deeply than you ever had before. That is alchemy. That is what radical transformation actually looks like from the inside. And from the outside, to the person who thought they had broken you, it looks like a completely different human being standing where a wounded one used to be. There is one thing that genuinely terrifies a narcissist. Not exposure. Not confrontation. Not someone gathering evidence of everything they did and laying it out in the open. Those things are uncomfortable for them, yes, but they're manageable. A narcissist can deflect exposure. They can charm their way out of confrontation. They can rewrite history so convincingly that even the people who witnessed it start to question what they actually saw. But there is one thing they cannot rewrite, one thing they cannot charm away, one thing that dismantles every tactic, every manipulation, every carefully constructed illusion they spent years building around you. An empath who knows exactly who they are. That is the thing they were never prepared for. Because the entire architecture of narcissistic control is built on one foundation: your self-doubt. Every move they made, every word they chose, every moment they twisted reality and made you question your own perception, all of it was designed to keep you uncertain. Uncertain about what you saw. Uncertain about what you felt. Uncertain about whether you were the problem, the burden, the one who was always too much or never quite enough. That uncertainty was not accidental. It was engineered. And it worked, for a while, because empaths are naturally inclined towards self-reflection. You question yourself. You examine your own behavior. You genuinely consider the possibility that maybe you were wrong, maybe you overreacted, maybe you are the one who needs to change. That quality, that beautiful, honest, deeply human quality, was turned into a weapon and used against you with surgical precision. Every time you started to see clearly, they introduced more doubt. Every time you got close to trusting yourself, they gave you a reason not to. Every time you almost walked away, they pulled you back with just enough warmth, just enough familiarity, just enough of what you originally fell for to make you stay. They knew exactly how much slack to give the rope. But here is where everything shifts, and this shift is the thing that changes the entire dynamic permanently. The moment an empath stops outsourcing their sense of reality to someone else, the moment they start trusting their own perception, their own memory, their own felt experience of what happened, the entire control structure collapses. Because it was never built on anything solid. It was built on your willingness to doubt yourself. And the second that willingness disappears, the foundation crumbles. All the tactics that worked before suddenly have nothing to grip. Gaslighting doesn't work on someone who trusts what they saw. Manipulation doesn't land on someone who understands the pattern. Guilt tripping falls completely flat on someone who has done the internal work and knows, genuinely knows, that they are not the villain in this story. And a narcissist who has lost their grip on your self-perception has lost everything. Watch what happens in that moment. Watch how quickly the mask shifts. Because when their tactics stop working, when the confusion doesn't come, when the guilt doesn't land, when you meet their manipulation with calm, clear, unshakable knowing, they reveal themselves completely. The charm disappears. The carefully maintained image starts cracking at the edges. And what comes out from behind that crack is not strength. It is desperation. Because they need you uncertain. They need you questioning. They need you slightly off balance at all times, because a slightly off balance empath is a controllable one. But a grounded empath? A self-aware empath who has done the work, who knows their patterns, who understands their own worth without needing anyone to confirm it. That empath cannot be controlled. And a person who built their entire sense of power on controlling you, suddenly standing in front of someone they cannot reach, cannot confuse, cannot manipulate, that is not just uncomfortable for them. That is existentially threatening, because you were supposed to stay small. You were supposed to keep doubting. You were supposed to need them. And you stopped, quietly, completely, without asking for their permission. And that single internal shift that nobody else could even see happening was the moment the power changed hands forever. Nobody sees it happening. That's the part nobody talks about. Everyone watches the transformation after it's complete. After the empath has walked away, rebuilt, and become someone almost unrecognizable from who they were inside that relationship. Everyone sees the outcome. The glow, the peace. The quiet confidence that wasn't there before. But nobody witnessed the moment it actually started. Because that moment didn't happen in public. It didn't happen in a conversation or a confrontation or a dramatic scene where everything finally came to a head. It happened somewhere deeply private. Somewhere so internal and so quiet that even the people closest to you had no idea it was occurring. It happened at 2 a.m. when the house was silent and you were sitting with a truth you had been avoiding for longer than you're willing to admit. It happened in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday when something someone said landed differently than it should have. And instead of explaining it away like you always did, you just let it land. And you felt it for what it actually was. That moment, that single, silent, completely invisible moment was the beginning of everything. Most people misunderstand how change works. They think transformation announces itself. They think there's a clear before and after, a visible line you cross where weakness ends and strength begins. But real change, and the deep, permanent, life-altering kind, it doesn't work that way. It builds underneath the surface for months sometimes. It accumulates quietly in the small decisions nobody notices. The one time you didn't apologize for something that wasn't your fault. The one boundary you held even though your hands were shaking. The one moment you chose your own peace over someone else's comfort, and didn't feel guilty about it afterward. Each of those moments was a brick. And you were building something while everyone else was still watching the old version of you, the one they thought they had completely figured out. That's what makes this particular kind of shift so powerful. The people around you, especially the ones who benefited from your uncertainty, were operating on outdated information. They were still treating you like the person who would apologize, still expecting the person who would shrink, still banking on the person who needed their approval to feel okay about existing. But that person was already gone. They just hadn't announced it yet, and there is something profoundly powerful about changing before anyone knows you've changed. Because it means the shift was never for them. It was never about making a statement or proving a point or showing someone what they lost. It was entirely, completely 100% for you. Done in private, sustained in private, strengthened in private. Through every quiet moment you chose yourself when the easier option was to go back to who you used to be. That kind of change cannot be taken from you. Because it wasn't given to you by anyone else's validation. It wasn't triggered by someone finally treating you right or finally apologizing or finally seeing your worth. It came from inside, from someplace so deep and so yours that no external circumstance could touch it. And that is the only kind of strength that actually holds. The kind that was built in silence. The kind that was tested in private before it ever faced the world. Think about what the world eventually sees. They see someone who carries themselves differently. Someone who doesn't scramble for approval anymore. Someone who can sit in discomfort without collapsing into it. Someone who speaks less but means every single word they say. Someone who has this quiet, unshakable quality about them that is almost impossible to describe but completely impossible to ignore. That quality has a name. It's called someone who has already done the work. And the work happened long before anyone was watching. It happened in the hardest, loneliest, most unglamorous moments of the entire journey. The ones that never make it into the highlight reel. The crying that nobody saw. The journaling at midnight. The therapy sessions where you finally said the thing you had been afraid to say out loud. The long walks where you argued with yourself and finally landed on your own side. All of that invisible labor, every single moment of it, was the real transformation. The world only sees the result. The empath lived through the process. And surviving that process, choosing yourself over and over again in the dark before anyone was watching, means by the time the world catches up to who you've become, you had already won, long before they even realized the game had changed.